Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. It's my joy and delight to welcome you to this time where each Sunday morning we explore important issues at the intersection of faith and the modern world. Today, we welcome back the Reverend Dr. Randall Balmer. He was one of our last in-person guests before the pandemic interrupted our way of living in March of 2020. And he also taught a Zoom class for us last summer. And now he's back to talk about his new book, Solemn, Reverence, The Separation of Church and State in American Life. We will have a follow-up session on Tuesday where Professor Balmer will be back. And so I encourage you to put that on your calendar, 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, where we'll have even more time to discuss this book and this issue. Professor Balmer, it's so good to see you.
I'm happy to be here, Peter. Good to see you again. And everybody else too, even though I can't see you. Hello.
Well, I think you're going to speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a chance for folks to send in their questions.
Good. I welcome that opportunity. Thank you once again for having me along to talk about this. It's actually a very slim book called Solemn Reverence, The Separation of Church and State in American Life. And just a couple of words about the genesis of this project. I don't know if you mentioned this, but I teach at Dartmouth College these days. And I write a monthly column for the local newspaper up there and a couple other papers in addition to doing various op-eds around the country. And somebody local contacted me up in Hanover and said, I like your columns. Would you be willing to write a small book on church and state in America? And I thought about it for a while and thought, well, I guess I could do that. So that's how this book came about. And it is really one of my passions, I have to say. I'm prepared to argue this morning or any other time, I suppose, that the separation of church and state is probably America's best idea. And I want to make that case here in a few minutes. But I'm glad for this forum because, obviously this is a religious group. I've been getting invitations from various atheist groups to talk about the separation of church and state in America. And I certainly understand their interest in the topic, but I'm prepared to argue again, and I will in a few minutes, that people of faith should be equally grateful for the First Amendment and for the separation of church and state in America, because I believe that the First Amendment set up a kind of free marketplace for religion in America. And in this marketplace, religion has flourished in America as really nowhere else. If you look at any of the figures, we Americans are off the charts in terms of our belief in God, in terms of our religious fidelity. It has dropped in recent years. I'm not going to deny that. I think there are reasons for that, which I can get into later if you want me to. But overall, we are a religious people, and I think it's precisely because of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, which has set up this free marketplace that allows for a salubrious religious climate, a lot of competition within the religious marketplace. And people in New York, I think, know that as well as anyone else. When you just walk down Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue or wherever it may be, there's a lot of different competing entities for faith. And I think that's a direct consequence of the First Amendment. So let's talk about this a little bit. When we think about the First Amendment and the separation of church and state, the metaphor really was introduced by Roger Williams. Roger Williams had been educated at Cambridge University back in the old world. He came to Massachusetts Bay as part of the wave of Puritans, and he was a Puritan minister in Salem, Massachusetts for a time. And he very quickly ran afoul of the religious and political authorities in Massachusetts because he objected to too close an association or an interlocking of church and state in colonial Massachusetts. And in fact, that was the whole idea behind Massachusetts Bay Colony, is to blend the two so that the two would be virtually indistinguishable. And Roger Williams discerned, I think, quite presciently that association was fraught. And he talked about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. And this is where we derive the metaphor for the separation of church and state. And I want to argue that Williams was really concerned about the integrity of the faith. Roger Williams and other settlers in the 17th century did not share our romantic notions about wilderness. To put it simply, Roger Williams was not a member of the Sierra Club, which of course didn't exist back then. For Roger Williams and for his contemporaries, wilderness was a place of darkness, of danger, where evil lurked. That was the habitation of Satan. And so when he talks about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, what he's really arguing is that in order to maintain the integrity of the faith, you have to separate it from the state, from the government. Well, those ideas got him into a lot of trouble in Puritan Massachusetts because, as I said, the whole idea behind Puritan Massachusetts was to integrate the two of them. And so he was put on trial, convicted of diverse and dangerous new opinions, and expelled from Massachusetts, whereupon during the winter of 1634-35, I think that's right, he walked down to Rhode Island and settled Rhode Island as a place of religious toleration and liberty of conscience. And Roger Williams is also the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. And so throughout American history, at least until 1979, when you had the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, you have Baptists who were really patrolling this wall of separation between church and state, ensuring that there would not be a blending of the two. And that, I think, turned out to be the right course. As the founders were beginning to think about the configuration of the new nation, trying to set up a government, they too recognized the importance of separation of church and state. And the reason for that, in part, had to do with their experience or their knowledge of what had happened back in the old world, where you had all these contestations among these various governments. But also you had the experience of the middle colonies in America. New York is one example, but also New Jersey, Pennsylvania, to some degree, Delaware. You had a religiously pluralistic population. And as the founders were thinking about configuring the new nation, one of the questions that would certainly have occurred to them is: Are we going to establish a religion? Are we going to have a state church? Which, by the way, was the pattern throughout Western history, is to have a state church ever since Constantine back in the 4th century, is to have this interlocking institutional relationship between religion and politics, between church and state. So as the founders were thinking about that, one of the questions that would have confronted them at one time or another would have been, well, which church are we going to establish as the one that enjoys the favor of the state? Well, if the founders would have decided on the Dutch Reformed Church, for example, the Congregationalists in New England wouldn't have been happy. If the founders had decided on the Church of England, the Congregationalists wouldn't have been happy, nor would the Dutch in New York. If they had decided on Unitarianism, everybody would have been upset, pretty much, except the Unitarians, I suppose. So that was one of the issues confronting them. And so, the founders, in their wisdom, and particularly James Madison, understood that the way to preserve peace was to allow these various groups to coexist with one another and, frankly, to compete with one another. One of the proving grounds was Virginia itself. Patrick Henry was enormously popular governor and held other offices in the Commonwealth of Virginia, proposed a legislation before the Virginia Assembly that would have established Christianity as the state religion. Well, that was a pretty savvy move on his part, because who's going to object to that? Well, and in fact, it looked like it was headed toward easy passage in the assembly. And finally, James Madison stepped up and wrote his famous memorial and remonstrance, arguing against establishing even Christianity as the religion of Virginia. And he was able to carry the day, and Virginia established or disestablished all religion in the colony. And that provided a kind of template for Madison crafting the First Amendment, which was passed by the Continental Congress and then finally ratified as part of the Bill of Rights in 1791. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And this is, again, I think it's America's best idea, because it has saved us from religious factionalism on the one hand, and it has also created this salubrious religious marketplace where you have all these religious entrepreneurs competing with one another for popular followings. And my field is American religious history, so I'm reasonably aware of this phenomenon. But you look at people like Joseph Smith or Elijah Muhammad or Ellen Gould White or Mary Baker Eddy. American religious history is littered with all of these religious entrepreneurs. Joel Osteen, to take a more recent example, among many others, who have been able to gain a foothold in this religious marketplace that was established really by the First Amendment. 1776 is important for all sorts of reasons, of course, the American Revolution, although there's an argument to be made that the most important event of 1776 was, in fact, and Peter, I'm sure, read this when he was a student at Columbia, because of the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, Brief for Free Market Capitalism. What is one of the examples that he uses? I'm not going to embarrass Peter by asking him this, but one of the examples he uses is religion. What would happen if there was no state church? And he said the effect would be a vibrant religious marketplace. And so he predicted this already in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, and again picked up by the founders. Well, there's a lot we could say. I'm kind of looking at my time. Peter and I sort of agreed on about 20 minutes for my rambling here, and I'm happy to take any questions. But throughout American history, there have been various attempts to designate the United States as a Christian nation. And I'm sure you're all aware that there's a movement right now among some evangelicals and others to insist on what is called Christian nationalism, that America is and always has been a Christian nation. You have people out there like Eric Metaxas and David Barton who are making this argument. And it's a specious argument. It's dangerous, as I said, I think, to the integrity of the faith, but it also represents an utter misreading of American history. And let me just go into this a little bit. One of the chapters in the book is about the Treaty of Tripoli. Well, you probably not immediately aware of the Treaty of Tripoli, but it was negotiated under George Washington and then presented to Congress by John Adams. And the Treaty of Tripoli contains language. This is a treaty that was meant to stem some of the piracy going on by the Barbary pirates in the late 18th century. But the Treaty of Tripoli was presented by John Adams to Congress, along with a note of endorsement on the part of Adams. And it was read aloud before the US Senate and approved or ratified unanimously by the United States Senate. And the Treaty of Tripoli reads in part, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And it goes on. That's a pretty clear statement of what the founding generation understood about whether or not the United States had a state church or was a Christian nation. It's pretty clear about that. But at various times throughout American history, there have been attempts to designate the United States as a Christian nation. One of the attempts occurred during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. And this is an initiative that got a lot of support from a lot of Americans. They sent a delegation to the White House, met with Lincoln. Lincoln, in his wisdom, temporized on that. And he said, well, it's a worthy idea, but let me think about it, as a way of saying, get out of here. I don't want to deal with this. And he offered some cautionary words about the dangers of trying to designate the United States as a Christian nation. Another attempt occurred, not surprisingly, during the Cold War, when the United States was in this kind of global contestation with godless communism. So what better time to designate the United States as a Christian nation? This is also the era during the Eisenhower administration when "In God We Trust" was placed onto our coinage and our currency, as Stephen Colbert once remarked, right where it belongs, on our money. And also when "In God We Trust" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And then another attempt occurred in the late 1960s after the school prayer and Bible reading decisions coming down from the Supreme Court. And Everett Dirksen of Illinois was one among the sponsors of an amendment to the Constitution that would have designated the United States as a Christian nation. Again, fortunately, in my judgment, that did not pass Congress. And so we still have this disestablishment. I think one way also to look at the success of this disestablishment for religion, for people of faith, is to go back to the early part of the 19th century. And even though the federal government, with the First Amendment, had established this notion of freedom of religion and no state church, the two states that were the last to disestablish their churches were Connecticut in 1818 and Massachusetts in 1833. And in both cases, of course, the Congregational Church was the state religion or the established religion. And by the way, I'm sure you know this, but Congregationalism is a direct lineal descendant of Puritanism. So that's one of the reasons that Congregationalism maintains such a tenuous, not tenuous, but a solid foothold in both Connecticut and Massachusetts. Lyman Beecher was a congregational minister in Litchfield, Connecticut at the time. And if you look through his writings, as Connecticut was preparing to disestablish the Congregational Church in Connecticut, he just wails in mourning at this prospect. It's going to be the worst thing that ever happened to Connecticut. Morals are going to just plummet throughout the state of Connecticut. He was apocalyptic about his understanding or his expectation of what would happen if the Congregational Church was no longer the established religion in Connecticut. Well, in 1818, it happened. The people of Connecticut voted to disestablish the Congregational Church, albeit by a small margin, but they did. 2 years later, Lyman Beecher, who had wailed about the prospect of disestablishment, said, "This is the best thing that ever happened to us in Connecticut." Revivals began to permeate the state because these different religious groups were set on their own task, their own. They were forced to survive on their own without the interlocking network of the state, and it's the best thing that ever happened to religion in Connecticut. So I take that as, I present that as evidence for the value of disestablishment and the separation of church and state. I think I'm pretty close to my 20 minutes, Peter. Does that work?
Excellent. Yep.
Okay. Good.
Thank you so much, Professor Balmer. And yes, I should have mentioned that Professor Balmer is the John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College. And we're very fortunate to have him with us again today. If you have a question for Professor Balmer, I encourage you to use the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And I should mention, we have an in-person audience for the forum today for the first time since March of 2020 in room 33. And if you're there, my colleague Manny Rodriguez-Leach will collect your questions. There are pens and cards there. You can also, of course, use your devices to send your questions to me as well. Professor Balmer, you are also an Episcopal priest. Our counterpart of the Episcopal Church's counterpart in England is the Church of England, which is established, of course, famously started by Henry VIII. I wonder what a comparison of the Episcopal Church to the Church of England tells us about the separation of church and state. Oh,
that's a great question. That's one of the things. It's one of the books I want to write before I retire or die or whatever is coming up. I would love to spend time in England and travel around the country and write a kind of state of the church book about the Church of England in England. And I don't know it intimately on that level, but my understanding, last I looked, I think 3% of the population in England attends the Church of England on any given Sunday. 3%. That's pretty telling, I think. That's and sad. I mean, I find it very, very sad because this is a church with a distinguished tradition, I think, and wonderful liturgy and music in many of these places, and nobody's participating. I think another comparison would be what has happened in the last few years in Scandinavia, where you have had until recently the state church of Lutheranism, and what happened has happened in both Sweden and Norway, as I understand. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but in recent years, the bishops of both of these churches have sought to become disestablished, to cut themselves off from state support, so that they could. I think they thought they would compete more fully in this religious marketplace that would be set up by disestablishment. Now, I don't know how that has turned out, whether there's been an influx of people since that has happened. Something to look into, and I really don't know the situation there. But I think the overall lesson, getting back to your question, comparing England or Great Britain generally with the United States, is that disestablishment works. Now, it's not to say that we Episcopalians are exactly flourishing in this religious marketplace, but I think there may be other reasons for that. And nevertheless, I think disestablishment has been a good thing.
One of the things, especially secular Americans, atheist Americans will often complain about, is the fact that churches and other religious organizations don't pay property tax, don't pay income tax. Although I like to point out that it's all 501c3s that don't do that. It's not just religious organizations.
Right.
You also write about in the book how clergy don't pay income tax on their housing allowance, although they do pay self-employment tax on that. And more recently, an example from last year and this year is that the Paycheck Protection Program also applied to religious organizations, which was controversial for some people, even though churches like ours really appreciated the inclusion in that program. So there are arguably these areas in which the separation is not complete. And I wonder if you can reflect on those.
Yeah, that's a very good observation and a good question. I'm troubled by this myself, I have to say. And should religious organizations enjoy tax exemption? And I also want to point out that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy, right? St. Bart's occupies some pretty nice real estate in New York City, and yet you guys don't pay property taxes to the city of New York. You may, some organizations voluntarily give some money to the municipal agencies, and I don't know if you do or not. It's not my business, but that means that other New Yorkers have to pony up a little bit more, right, in order to pay St. Bart's share of fire protection, police services, parks, and recreation, and all this stuff, right? So tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. I don't think there's any way around that. That is the case. Now, is that a good thing? I guess I come down on the side that yes, it's not a bad thing, at least. And the founders recognized the value of voluntary associations, and that's what a church is or a religion is. So I think they were prepared to offer that sort of concession to what we call now today tax-exempt organizations. So, but you raise a very, very good point. And should clergy have their housing allowance essentially subsidized by other taxpayers? I think that's another good question. I'm not going to rule on that one myself. I mean, it's no real advantage to me, so it's not a self-interested statement. But I want to be invited back to St. Bart's.
I should say that is constantly getting challenged in the courts, but no challenge has been successful yet.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
We have a question about the comment you included from Williams about the garden and the wilderness of the world, and specifically what that suggests for our current moment. Do we really want to suggest that the church is pristine and the world is kind of naughty and
Oh, yeah. I mean, sure. It's no, I mean, the church is certainly not pristine. We all know that. And because it's populated with flawed human individuals like me, I won't speak for you, Peter, but I'm certainly one of those flawed individuals. But I do want to claim Roger Williams's point about the dangers to the integrity of the faith when it's too closely allied with the state. And he feared that the faith would become trivialized or even fetishized by too close an association with the state. And I have an example of that. Some years ago, I'm sure many folks remember this, Roy Moore, who was at that time the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court before he went on to become the defeated Republican nominee for Senate several years back, insisted on putting, he won election as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court by running as the Ten Commandments judge, because as a lower court judge, he had placed the Ten Commandments on the wall of his courtroom, and he promised to install a monument to the Ten Commandments in the judicial building in Alabama if he were elected Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, which of course he was. And he proceeded to make good on that pledge. And so this granite monument, the size of a washing machine, was placed in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery, Alabama, emblazoned with the Ten Commandments. And so various entities, including the American Civil Liberties Union, Southern Poverty Law Center, and several others, challenged this in court. And actually, I was actually one of the expert witnesses summoned down to Montgomery to testify in that case. And my testimony was essentially what I said today. That is, the First Amendment, the disestablishment of religion, has really ensured a vigorous, salubrious religious marketplace in America. And to try to compromise that by placing the Ten Commandments in exclusion of all other religious traditions, by the way, in that space, represented a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. I think it's pretty clear about that. Well, the judge agreed and ordered the removal of that monument. As the workers were preparing to remove the monument, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." Now, unless I miss my guess, one of the commandments on the side of that monument says something about graven images. And it proves Roger Williams' point, right? If you elide the separation of church and state, you subject the faith to fetishization, as it was on the side of that granite monument, and you demean the faith. You minimize the importance of the faith, and I think Roger Williams recognized that. So I want to emphasize that point.
Another person wonders about the Supreme Court's current approach to separation of church and state, and specifically points out that the blurring of this separation tends to come from those who call themselves originalists or are inspired by.
Yeah. Oh no.
How do you make sense of that? Yeah.
Actually, I have an op-ed today in several newspapers about originalism, particularly as it relates to the Second Amendment, and I think I'm arguing that if the Supreme Court justices take seriously original intent, the New York law should be upheld as it comes before the Supreme Court. I don't think the founders were aware of AR-14s. I just don't think that was part of what they had in mind with the Second Amendment. But anyway, that's a larger argument. Yes, the Supreme Court, I think there's reason to be worried about this. The Montana decision, I think, was a calamitous decision. And I actually have a chapter in the book about the so-called Blaine amendments, which were passed into a good number of state constitutions that forbade the use of public funds for religious schools, for religious instruction. And I think that's a proper line of separation between church and state that needs to be maintained. Unfortunately, it's being blurred rather dramatically, I think, by some recent court decisions. And of course, the previous Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, really has spent her entire life trying to provide public support for religious and other private schools. I think that's a very, very dangerous thing to do. And I say that in the context of, I've written about this many, many times, my profound appreciation for public education. I'm a product of public schools myself, and I believe passionately in public education. I think public education is our best shot at democracy and the perpetuation of democracy. Because public schools, or common schools as they were known in the 19th century, were founded as a way to provide this meeting ground for children from different religious, ethnic, even socioeconomic backgrounds, where they could learn from one another in the classroom or on the playground, learn to get along together. And that, I think, is our best chance at democracy going forward at a time when democracy is very much under attack, in my judgment.
Are there other major threats you see at the moment to the separation of church and state?
Well, this whole Christian nationalist movement, I think, is very worrisome because these people have a platform, they have a following, and they're prepared to press their claims on this, even though they're historically dubious. That's a mild word for it. And I think part of the problem is, and this is part of the reason I do what I do, that is to be not only a scholar who produces scholarly publications, but somebody who tries to speak in the larger arena of public discussion on these matters. You have people like this David Barton or this Eric Metaxas, who are constantly talking about Christian nationalism. And as David Barton claims to be a historian, he's not a historian. He's not. He's. I mean, certainly has no formal credentials to buttress his claim of being a historian. But yeah, he's going around persuading a lot of people that America is and always has been a Christian nation. Well, that's demonstrably false, and very few people are out there trying to refute that nonsense. And as it begins to take hold, I think that's a real danger to democracy, certainly, but it's a real danger to the First Amendment and to the separation of church and state. So in my little puny, even pathetic way, I'm trying to refute some of these arguments and trying to at least force them to reconsider what they consider to be settled history on this issue when it's not.
Can you talk a little more about the origins of separation of church and state? Did Williams have precedents that he looked at that informed?
Williams. Good question. Williams is a curious figure. He apparently wasn't all that easy to get along with in some ways, and he picked this up. There's some evidence he picked it up from a Scottish thinker whose name I've forgotten for the moment, although it's in the book here somewhere. I'm not going to take my time to look it up, where he picked that up and he wrote about it in a kind of refutation. There was a kind of pamphlet war between Williams and Cotton Mather in Massachusetts. And he wrote about it in one of his books and talked about this wall of separation between church and state. But I think what prompted it for him was a sense that there was too close an association with the state, and that would imperil the integrity of the faith. And he also believed very firmly in the notion of liberty of conscience, in part because he was expelled from Massachusetts because of his independent ideas. And so as he formed what is now Rhode Island, he insisted that it be a place for freedom of conscience. And as a result, you have all these religious groups kind of descending onto Rhode Island because it was one of the few havens, one of the few safe spaces for people who held religious convictions considered outside of the mainstream at that time.
Can you talk about the connection between the separation of church and state and American ideas of freedom? To what extent was separation of church and state seen as freedom?
Well, I think one evidence for that is that the First Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. That was, of course, tacked on after the Constitution had been written. And there was a good bit of controversy among the founders about whether or not to include a Bill of Rights. And Madison himself, who drafted the Bill of Rights, was not sure that it was a great idea because he was afraid that unless certain rights were specified, let me say that differently. He was afraid that anything outside of the rights that were specified in the Bill of Rights would not be considered a right. And he thought that that was perhaps too restrictive and opened the door to further mischief. In the end, he decided to sit down and draft these articles because he was afraid of who else might do it if he didn't do it. So he wanted to ensure that it was done right. So yes, I think these are part of our fundamental freedoms, and It's at the core of who we are as a country. And let's remember, this is the First Amendment, right? This notion, this is the first clause of the First Amendment. Second clause has to do with freedom of press, which is equally important, I think, and probably equally imperiled these days, but that's a whole other conversation. But let's remember that this issue of religion was the first clause of the First Amendment, the first article of First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. So certainly the founders thought this was very important.
A question about religious literacy and education about religion in schools. Does separation of church and state get in the way of making sure our kids are informed enough about the religions of the world?
Yeah, it's a really crucial issue, and the one shorthand to understand this is to make a distinction between teaching religion and teaching about religion, and there's been a lot of confusion about that. People misunderstanding the separation of church and state and the First Amendment to the extent that they say, well, we can't really talk about Puritans, or we can't talk about religion or religious forces in the formation of American history. And that's simply wrong. What does cross the line is any attempt to catechize within the context of public education. That is beyond the bounds, in my judgment, of the First Amendment and the Disestablishment Clause of the First Amendment. But I see this in my own field. My field is American religious history, and students come. When I was at Columbia and at Dartmouth, I'll exclude you, Peter, from that characterization. But students come with a remarkable and appalling ignorance about the role of religion in American history, because they haven't been taught that in the schools, for fear that there would be some sort of transgression of the First Amendment. And that's simply false. I don't believe you can understand American history without understanding the role that religion has played in American history. Puritans are an obvious example, but in the 19th century, to understand the social and political agenda for most of the century, you have to understand the Second Great Awakening. You have to come to terms with people like Theodore Weld and Charles Grandison Finney and the Grimsby sisters, because they were foundational in setting the social and political agenda for much of the 19th century.
Someone asks about the Danforth letter, and I have to admit I don't know what they're referring to, but perhaps you do.
I don't know for sure. Is this the recent? The Danbury letter?
It says
yes.
Danforth,
Yeah.
but it may be Danbury. Yeah.
I think it's a reference to the only other thing I can think of is John Danforth, the former senator from Missouri, who recently made a comment about Josh Hawley, but I don't think that's what the listener is asking him. But if I'm wrong about that, please come back to me. Yeah, the Danbury letter, it's fascinating. I actually have a whole chapter in the book about that. On January 1st, 1802, New Year's Day, 1802, Thomas Jefferson was president, and several things happened that day. One of them was rather curious. When Jefferson was living in Virginia, one of his neighbors there was a Baptist preacher by the name of John Leland. And John Leland and Jefferson formed a very close friendship, apparently. And then Leland went up to become pastor of a Baptist congregation in Massachusetts, Cheshire, Massachusetts. And in the election of 1800, which was bitterly fought between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and talk about religion in politics, that's a good election to study, because it was really quite brutal. John Leland and his congregation supported Thomas Jefferson because he was his party affiliation was called at the time Democratic Republican. whereas most of their neighbors in all of New England were Federalists at that time, supporters of John Adams. Well, at any rate, John Leland was eager to show the new president, Jefferson, that not all New Englanders opposed him. And so he called on his neighbors there in Cheshire, Massachusetts, to bring all of the milk from their dairy cows on one particular day to make a mammoth wheel of cheese. They actually had to use an apple cider press in order to accommodate that. The wheel of cheese weighed over 1,200 pounds. He was also careful to instruct that no Federalist milk be included in this wheel of cheese because it would give the cheese a bad savor, as he said. And then Leland proceeded to take the cheese all the way down to Washington, D.C., over 500 miles on sled and down the Hudson River and so forth, to present it to Thomas Jefferson as a token of appreciation from the people of Cheshire, Massachusetts, for Thomas Jefferson and for his policies. And he presents this to Jefferson on New Year's Day, 1802. And Jefferson receives it gratefully. And there's evidence that cheese stuck around for several years because it was so big in the White House. Anyway, later that day, and I find this conjunction fascinating, Jefferson sat down and wrote his famous letter to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut. Now, the backstory there was that the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, again being a religious minority, had written to Thomas Jefferson to ensure that he still believed in the First Amendment. Essentially, he still believed in the importance of the separation of church and state. And so Jefferson sits down that afternoon and pens this letter to the Danbury Baptists, in which he said, "I hold with solemn reverence," which is where the title to this book comes from, that act of the American people, referring to the First Amendment, that I forget the language, but Jefferson affirms his fidelity to the First Amendment, thereby creating a line of separation between church and state. So that's where the phrase line of separation, church and state, comes from. Now, the so-called Christian nationalists seize on this and they say, the notion of separation of church and state, the language of separation of church and state doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Well, they're right about that. I'll give them that point. But that comes from Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, where he affirms his commitment to the First Amendment and to the separation of church and state. So to argue against that in favor of Christian nationalism will be to say that Thomas Jefferson was somehow mistaken in his understanding. He was one of the founders, right? That he was somehow mistaken in his understanding of the First Amendment. And I think that's a pretty tough argument to sustain. So that's the letter to the Danbury Baptists, and that's where we get this phrase, separation of church and state.
Got it. So we're at time, but I'll squeeze in one final question quickly. You write in the book about threats to separation of church and state from the right, but we're seeing a lot of passion now for the religious left and some renewed discussion about the religious left, even though many of advocates for separation of church and state come from the left. Do you see any blurring of the lines between church and state on the left as well?
I think there are. I think there is a bit of a threat there, and it's important in those conversations to emphasize the second clause of that first part of the First Amendment. That is freedom of religious expression. That is also guaranteed by the First Amendment, along with disestablishment. So I think there are some people on the left who have taken this too far to argue that people of faith cannot express their views in the arena of public discourse. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think the arena of discourse would be impoverished without those views coming from people with religious convictions. Now, I also want to emphasize that I think that people who are expressing their religious convictions in the arena of public discourse also have to observe the norms of democracy. That is, they can speak their mind, but I think they also need to listen to other views and to recognize that their views, because they are generated from religious conviction, have no precedence, at least not necessarily, over the views of people, those with coming into public discourse with no acknowledged religious convictions. So yes, I think there are dangers on both sides, yes.
Well, we'll have to leave it there for now, but the conversation continues on Tuesday. Professor Balmer has agreed to join us for a follow-up session Tuesday evening from 6:30 to 8. Details are in the live chat, the comments, and on our website, stbarts.org. If you've appreciated today's conversation or any of the conversations we've hosted recently, we encourage you to give generously to sustain the forum, stbarts.org/give. We hope you'll join us next week when we welcome Anthony Pinn, who's a professor at Rice University, and we'll be talking about the Reverend Pauli Murray, an Episcopal priest, civil rights activist, lawyer, and trailblazer for LGBTQ+ people. Please join us then. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m. Thank you so much, Professor Balmer, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching.